Welcome to another episode of the Parmenius podcast. Bernard Willis, how you doing today, Bernard?
Good.
Good, excellent. Today, we're excited to talk to another guest, a former friend of Parmenius, very close, who used to organize and help with the philosophy groups here. Brady Sheppard, now a master's student in philosophy at Western University, specializing in looking into ancient philosophy and Aristotle. Brady, thanks for being on the pod and talking to us today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Beautiful. So we were talking a lot about aesthetic judgments. We're talking about, and the Parmenius podcast has been getting into this lately a lot in from different angles. We're talking about values at the basis of aesthetic judgments and some of the metaphysical questions there. So with that, maybe I can ask you how you came to this question.
For me, it all roots in a kind of observation. And Bernard, in a blog post, actually came to a similar observation. It's this idea that everyone proclaims that, aesthetic judgment, taste, that whole thing, it's subjective, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. We've heard that a million times. But despite the kind of frequent proclamation that it's all subjective, no one really acts like it's all subjective. And that's why I think Bernard gave the really very real example of, if you tell a Black Sabbath fan that Taylor Swift is better, even if they think that it's all subjective, they will just freak out at you. It's almost an intuitive reaction that, of course, Taylor Swift can't be better than Black Sabbath. So it's difficult. How do you reconcile this idea that it's all subjective, despite acting like there is some kind of objective order of the arts? And that's something that I've been really interested in.
So you're kind of trying to aim at a certain sort of tacit objectivity that we all work within when it comes to discussing artworks.
And what is that tacit objectivity is the problem.
Exactly. And so my kind of approach to it has been to question whether there is any objectivity at work here. Because actually, again, Bernard, I believe in your notes on the critique of humor, in the opening paragraph, you kind of invoke like the Kantian, let's look at what principles are actually operative here, and then kind of illuminate them. And I think that's a really important or meaningful way to approach the issue. And so that's kind of what I've done here as well. Because a lot of people intuitively just want to say, like, yeah, there must be some kind of objectivity we operate within, but I'm not so sure that there is. What I kind of propose is this, it's a Kantian term, he doesn't employ it in this way, but a kind of inner subjectivity that is at work here. And all that to say is, although it is all subjective, there is this kind of broader subjectivity in which, we have a consensus on which criteria we should evaluate art according to, which of these is generally more valuable. And we try to look at that. We try to look at consensus to make these judgments. And that, I think, is what people are feeling when they think that they're operating on something objective. Because I think this inner subjectivity, because of its kind of popularity, it's really operative in the kind of sphere of the critics and the professionals, because it has this power backing it. It might feel as if it's objective, but I think if we look closer underneath of it, I mean, the fact that we're using any of these criteria, the fact that we value them the way we do, it's very contingent on us valuing them that way. It could have been any other criteria. It could have been any other order. And so I think highlighting that gets to the root of it all, which is that it's still subjective, but it's not this kind of personal contingent subjectivity, I guess.
Okay. So what you're suggesting then is that in some sense it's true that aesthetic judgment is subjective, but at the same time, aesthetic judgment is not simply private. Okay?
Right.
Yeah. So there are certain kinds of intersubjective social agreements that we have about, say, what constitutes, good tap dancing.
Right.
So I go to, a tap dancing competition, or I go to a figure skating competition, and the judges at that competition have certain conceptions, certain standards about excellence in that craft or art, and correspondingly what is not excellent in that craft or art. So I suppose the next question would be, how is it that they formulate those?
Yeah, that is really one of the big issues here, and one that I question frequently, but I wonder if it has something to do with convenience. And that's something that I've been thinking about a lot, because if we think, for instance, like in music making, we think of the classic like kind of 4-chord structure. That's it's been very conventional to use that because it's useful for creating songs that typically provoke, a positive reaction from audiences. They're very palatable, it's digestible. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's that kind of utility that we get these conventions. But again, I think because that utility is very contingent on, what is pleasurable in a certain kind of milieu, a different period in time, that again, this is just all to support the idea that there's nothing inherently better about, say, using this chord structure versus another. It's just what's kind of more convenient or what's more useful, which produces more pleasure at a certain time. Again, I just like to cite these kind of things because I really do feel like we need to fight claims that there is some kind of inherent hierarchy of the arts or, features of arts, because I feel like that is truly when we get the death of art. And so I guess that's why I'm fighting so firmly for this position.
Okay. So let me put it this way, I suppose. I mean, this is what I was kind of reflecting on as I, came in to do this podcast. So you're studying ancient philosophy, Brady, so you know Plato's Parmenides, presumably.
Right.
Yeah. And Socrates Socrates who asks Parmenides whether there's a form of hair or mud.
Yeah.
Okay? And of course, I think Plato's implicit answer is, well, in some sense, there is a form of hair or mud. Okay? Mm-hmm. And the significance of that, of course, is that, if you're in the Platonist tradition, there's a kind of assumed unity of the transcendentals, right? So mm-hmm. that which is unified is in some sense beautiful. Okay? Mm-hmm. So then, of course, later with Kant and, aesthetic thought in the 19th century, say, there's much more emphasis on, well, the aesthetic is a distinct kind of experience from, say, the ethical or the natural. Okay? Right. And then further in the 20th century, finally, you get, that whole thing blown wide open again when, Duchamp puts a urinal in an art gallery and says, look at this urinal. John Cage sits at his piano doing nothing for 4 minutes and 30 seconds, where the artist there is challenging you to say, well, actually, considered from a certain angle, considered from a certain perspective, mud is beautiful, say, okay?
Right.
Or hair, hair, we all know hair is beautiful, right? Because beautiful hair. So there is, I think in these kind of early 20th century artists, a kind of reversion to the perception that somehow aesthetic experience is everywhere, or the aesthetic is a category that's everywhere and nowhere, if you like, right? Mm-hmm. So that there is potentially an experience of beauty in almost anything, okay? And so and I suppose the example I might revert to is like, I don't find a pile of mud very beautiful, and probably you don't either, Brady.
Yeah, certainly not.
Or I don't find a pile of hair after the haircut to be, hair is beautiful on a head, right? I mean, hair is beautiful in a certain context, etc. Now, if I were a chemist and I were analyzing the mud, there would be quite possibly certain aesthetic factors at play in what the chemist is doing, right? Look at the complex chemistry and, oh, it's symmetrical and beautiful, and I really love the chemistry of this thing, right? So there's a kind of legitimate perspectivalism based on the fact that if, as certain ancient aestheticians would say, some kind of order or some kind of unity or some kind of symmetry is at the heart of aesthetic experience, then, well, in that case, there is some kind of aesthetic angle or some kind of aesthetic approach to literally any object whatsoever. Anything that instantiates a principle of order has beauty from some perspective or in some way. Okay? So would you be happy, Brady, to kind of, like Cage or like Duchamp, overturn or at least seriously question the distinction between aesthetic and non-aesthetic experience?
So I think that's a really interesting point, because as you kind of brought out there, in a certain sense, anything can be contextualized to be a piece of art, and it's more dependent upon
Like
the context. Well, exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm very sympathetic to that view, and I think I'm totally willing to subscribe to that. I think anything can be art, but not everything can be art for me, because I don't have the necessary context within which to evaluate everything as art.
Yeah.
But I think that's a perfectly legitimate perspective. However, the issue arises then, how do we approach discourse on, the beauty of the mud? I mean, of course, we would have to limit it to those who have that context. But at certain points, the context has become so niche that the amount of people to partake in that discourse will become smaller and smaller and smaller. And so the issue becomes, how do we then, I guess, get discourse out of such niche communities? And how can we compare the beauty of the mud to the beauty of the Mona Lisa? And can we even make that kind of comparison? So these are the kind of issues that come out of that perspective.
Sure. So there's a certain, because if you're making aesthetic judgment, Brady, in some sense, you're engaging in an active comparison.
Right.
Like that is not only beautiful, but it's more beautiful than this.
Yes.
Okay? So, and of course, we're all interested in what those principles of comparison could be. And I think, my position would be that implicitly, as you began by saying, we all indeed have certain principles of aesthetic judgment that aren't really thematic or conscious for us, but they determine the way we evaluate, say, I don't know, a Tiny Tim song versus a Beethoven symphony.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interestingly, I think maybe on this issue, Kant has something useful to say, in that the kind of locus that we use to compare things that are beautiful is this kind of common sense that he calls it. But it's essentially this: when we make a judgment regarding something's beauty or a judgment regarding taste, what we're saying is that we have this feeling. And, he gives us all this kind of metaphysical, epistemological foundation. But the upshot is that when we say that something's beautiful, what we're doing is that we're drawing upon this feeling that we have, and we're saying that anyone in this kind of specific set of conditions would have the same feeling. And so we kind of, that the principle, the most important principle, is that feeling that we have when we view a piece of art.
Mm-hmm. But there's a deep irony here, if I could interject, because I don't know if Kant uses that word common sense, Brady. I'm sorry, I don't want to quote you here, but if it's a common sense and we're trying to have a kind of refined intellectual discourse about it, there seems to be a deep irony there to say that there's a commonsensical thing upon which we can act or enact some kind of great aesthetic judgment power that doesn't fit back into this ancient idea of order, symmetry, unity, being kind of like aesthetic being leveled so that all experience becomes this aesthetic ground. Do you see what I mean about this deep irony?
Yeah, I kind of do. I should just note, though, that this idea of the common sense, it's a very peculiar usage. He means quite literally a sense within each individual that is common to all of us. It has to do with our imagination and understanding of the relation to one another, how we experience things, yada, yada, yada. But I think one of the issues with this model is, if the primary locus of aesthetic experience is this feeling we have, that feeling is very private. You and me could both look out at a sunset and we could both have some kind of reverence towards it, but our feelings of reverence, our admiration, is qualitatively different, because of course I have my own set of experiences, backgrounds, values, biases, etc., that predispose me towards this specific feeling, whereas yours are slightly different. And so how can we meaningfully, I suppose, talk about that aesthetic experience, given that it's so highly private? Now, Kant's kind of cheeky answer to say, well, if you're truly disinterested, as you should be when you make these judgments, then everyone will just kind of feel the same. And I'm not so sure I'm convinced by that, but that is trying to get at the issue of, well, how can we have meaningful discourse if the experience is kind of primary here?
So if we won't feel the same, maybe the twist is to say that the thing that our experience is operating on, aka like you just said, the natural world, the sunset, the plant, the beauty of like a tree in the wind we've discussed before, maybe that's what unifies us all. Maybe instead of some kind of commonsensical within experience, maybe it's the material that the experience is acting on. That's
That's a great point. But then we now run into the problem Bernard raised that, a piece of mud can be beautiful in a certain context. So even the objects outside of us aren't always necessarily viewed as a piece of art or the same context. So that just muddles the issue even more, I guess.
Okay, so here's something I might suggest as a way out of this. We might say that in a certain sense, say Cage or Duchamp is right, okay, that contextualized in a certain way, we can have an aesthetic response to almost any conceivable object, okay? And I mean, just look at the, great multiplicity of things that painters render, say, right? From the face of the Mona Lisa or to an orange stripe, or think of a Klaus Oldenburg statue of a clothespin or something. It's like, suddenly I'm looking at a clothespin completely. Okay. So we can suggest, that some aesthetic response, right, or some potential for aesthetic response is built into any experience whatsoever, because the word aesthetic just refers at the end of the day to the senses, right? The aesthetes, and of course, as Aristotle points out, we take pleasure in the use of the senses. There's a pleasure to be taken even in a sound. There's a pleasure to be taken even in a sight. Okay, so we start with a kind of baseline. Right? We'll start with that Aristotelian baseline. Sensible experience, or the exercise of perception, has some intrinsic delight, like even for a dog who takes delight in sniffing or, whatever, right? And so starting from that baseline, right, we move to experiences of things that are consciously contrived to heighten that already there, in some sense, aesthetic response, right? So a piece of music builds upon our natural delight in sound, our natural delight in the use of our ears, and constructs something that is designed to heighten that experience. So music is designed in a certain sense to heighten and intensify the inherent pleasure of hearing. Painting is designed to heighten and intensify the inherent pleasure of seeing, right? Because aesthetic objects are all, in some sense, quote unquote, objects of perception or our senses, right? Unless it's mathematics or something. We won't get into that for the moment. So everything has the potential, okay, to evoke some level of aesthetic response, but art objects are particularly those objects which are so contrived as to heighten and intensify that response, so that, like, the quantity becomes a quality of its own, right? The experience is so heightened that we create this kind of separate category of artworks. I don't know.
I definitely think looking at it in this way, we can start to. Well, actually, let me look at it this way. I think it's a really convincing story that if we look at intent, like you said, there's this inherent pleasure to be heard in sound, and then the musician takes advantage of that and then creates something that I guess just through observing what will produce the most pleasure, we kind of stick that in this kind of unity to create music, which then gives us even more pleasure than just the sound of wind or something.
Mm-hmm. But the sound of is pleasant, right?
Yeah, no doubt about that.
Truly.
But yeah. I wonder if then is the upshot of this kind of view that music is better than the sound of, say, nature, the wind going through the trees and the birds chirping. Is that kind of a consequence of this view, or?
Okay, let's bite the bullet on that and see where we go. Suppose I say, well, yeah, actually, the wind chime on my doorstep is nice, but a piece of choral music is nicer, right? In the sense that, it's the way I put it in my article, okay? That there seem to me three components to an art object, right? And the one component is its unity or its symmetry. The other component is its difference or complementarity. And the third component is the play between those two factors. Okay. So I'm happy to say, well, whatever's the case about the wind chime, in the piece of music, I experience those things more fully and more freely and more gratifyingly, at least in relation to my own sensibility. Okay. Mm-hmm. Right. So like if I'm God, say, I have, this kind of universal unified perception of the beauty and order and complementarity and play in every single thing. Okay. But I'm not God. Okay.
Right.
And since I'm not God, I need certain kind of specially contrived experiences to see those qualities of things. Right. And then, by the way, then looking at a landscape, I can go back and look at nature and because perception has this kind of interesting relationship to art that Oscar Wilde describes somewhere. He says, well, you can see an Italian countryside, and then you see, landscape painting from Quattrocento or something, and then you look at that countryside again, and it's transformed. Now I'm seeing more. I'm seeing more subtly. I'm seeing more freely. Maybe.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. So I kind of like the direction of this. So okay. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's the kind of having this artistic intention to heighten the inherent pleasure in the senses already that kind of distinguishes art from just an ordinary aesthetic experience of, say, nature. Is that kind of the principle that distinguishes the two? All right.
Yeah.
So I wonder then, what if we were to recontextualize the kind of aesthetic experience of nature? What if you were to conceive it as, being designed by God, for instance, and so to give us that inherent pleasure? And I think if you kind of make that argument, I mean, I don't think it would be too crazy to say that there are a lot of people that would probably say, well, the sound of nature is so pleasurable to me that I'd rather that than listening to, say, Taylor Swift. So then we kind of have the kind of breakdown of that boundary a little bit.
Yeah. Because... Right. Since all aesthetic experience acts in concert with individual sensibility at some point. So it always gets filtered through some sort of subjectivity. Okay. Mm-hmm. There's always going to be the odd person who's going to say, well, I find more aesthetic gratification in a waterfall than I do in a symphony. And that's fine. Right.
Right.
Because the aesthetic experience is being filtered through a sensibility that's had certain experiences, or a sensibility that's, some person with very acute hearing might find music unendurable.
Mm-hmm.
And other people like this, right? Some people with very poor vision might find paintings harder to read, et cetera, right? So you never free aesthetic experience entirely from accidents of sensibility and accidents of personal character and accidents of experience, right? So that's why, I can play someone, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and they'll be bored as tears. And I could play them the Taylor Swift song, and they love the Taylor Swift song. Right? Because in a certain sense, I suppose what the Beethoven symphony is doing to them is overloading their sensibility. So they prefer the kind of directness and simplicity of a pop song, right? Because in a certain sense, the process of aesthetic education is the process of learning to appreciate more and more complex, varied forms, et cetera, right? But nobody is obligated to be aesthetically educated, right? I mean, people have the option always of just preferring their, simpler, more untutored responses to that. And, if that's what turns you crank, that's what turns you crank, right?
Right.
Okay. But we do kind of expect a certain degree of aesthetic education from cultured people, don't we, Brady?
Yeah, I'd absolutely see that.
And if not, I have some Irish Rovers records to, introduce you to, right? Because there's this whole category of the naive, right?
Mm-hmm.
That there's a certain distrust of naive aesthetic perception, because of course that embraces things like the Irish Rovers Unicorn Song, or the Tastes the Children show in you couldn't pay me $1 million to sit and listen to a Raffi record, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. I guess the thing that I wonder about is, are we just kind of way beyond Kantianism here in terms of, the construction of aesthetic experience?
Yeah, I would certainly say so, but I have my whole slew of reasons for rejecting the Kantian model.
Mhm.
I mean, at its basis, this notion of disinterestedness.
Yeah.
I think that's a kind of untenable demand for the subject to be disinterested in the piece of art they're experiencing.
Yeah.
In a sense, Schopenhauer kind of has a twist on it where the aesthetic experience is the most freeing experience of all, because of course he has this metaphysics of the will and how we're just manifestations of this, striving towards nothing. But the aesthetic experience for Schopenhauer ends up in being like this kind of disconnect from you and the will, and you kind of just become absorbed in the object, in a sense, and almost kind of interest. So, but even like, just to recontextualize that in a modern context, if we look at it in terms of biases or whatnot, especially post-Freudian kind of revelation, there's no kind of just cutting ourselves off from our biases and our personal values. So we always have some kind of unconscious bias or interest either towards or against something, and that's nothing more than the culmination of certain values and biases. So I mean, that demand itself, I think, falls flat on its face after some kind of inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
But
I am able to say things like, that person is a really good dancer, even though my aesthetic appreciation and experience of dance is that, like, I don't get it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is a certain degree, like in a person who has moved from the level of pure preference to what I call the level of taste, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a certain recognition that there is a kind of free aesthetic judgment by which I can praise and even admire things that I don't actually like.
Yes. Yeah. And I think
dance, right?
Yeah. A large part of that, I think, is, again, going back to that idea I mentioned earlier about just these kind of conventions, there is this kind of just conventional understanding of what is good dancing, for example. And the reason we kind of inherit that and the reason that we kind of adopt that is because if you watch television, I mean, the ones that make it on television are going to be the ones that most closely resemble that conventions. And so just through receiving that, we kind of abstract this convention of what good dancing might consist in. And even if I don't like dancing, I will just be predisposed towards, identifying at some level what is good dancing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the subject can be liberated from the privacy of his or her own perceptions, at very least by participation in a community, in what we might call an aesthetic community, or I think I call it in that piece an aesthetic milieu,
mm-hmm,
right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a certain community that has certain assumptions about what good, fiddle playing is, or what good Highland dancing is, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm at the point where I don't really feel I need to disentangle the disinterested end of the spectrum from the interested end of the spectrum, right? Because as far as I can see, they are inherently linked. But even within the limits of my own subjectivity, I do have that capacity to take a kind of God's eye view and say, well, this art form, I'll just use a personal example, tangos.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm bored to death by tangos.
Yeah.
And I know people who love tangos. Okay. But I can say, wow, that tango musician there is really, really good. I could recognize that he has done something aesthetically excellent, because aesthetic experience does involve categories in some sense, right? Mm-hmm. So is there a kind of unity to his performance? Is that unity set off by sufficient variety, et cetera, right? So in a sense, there are, even buried within the accidents of our personal subjectivity, certain kinds of categorical determinations about aesthetic experience, of which, if you're you read Plotinus's Aeneid of the Beautiful, right? On the beautiful. Well, that's ultimately, the one for him, right? Like the one like the power of the one, the power of, ultimate metaphysical unity manifests itself in something like light. Okay.
Mhm.
And like Plotinus even says that you can have an aesthetic experience of the undifferentiated. That's like one of his, criticisms of certain other aesthetic theories of his day, right? Because of course there are people who, very much like I just said, would say that, beauty is a manifestation of an interplay, kind of play between unity and difference, right? Between the one and the dyad, if you like. But Plotinus says, well, you can even have an aesthetic experience of the undifferentiated, as in, like you're sitting on a beach in a Greek island, right? And then it's just light pouring around you and you go, oh my God, right? Or kind of the blue of the sea, maybe, right?
Mhm.
But art objects, like that's, part of the beauty of nature, but art objects, specifically designed for aesthetic purposes, I think do involve some kind of energy of play, differentiation, and difference, right? Even though that, sunlight or the blue of the sea, or, what's that? There's a painter, Yves Klein, right, who invented a shade of blue, right? And you go like, damn, that's a beautiful blue, right? You can't look at Yves Klein all day. So I don't know. Brady, where are we going with this?
Well, about this idea of the undifferentiated, there's a certain sense, and I wonder if you even agree with this, that we could almost at this point probably, and they probably already have, input, a bunch of pop songs into like an algorithm, for instance, and that could just pump out something that is just, very cut and dry, very standard for the genre. Would that qualify as something that's undifferentiated because it's qualitatively so similar to everything else, or is it already kind of like a bit of variety in it, just in the sense that that specific arrangement has never been done before?
It's got to be a new instantiation of the same pattern. So
Right.
at very least, there's a material differentiation between one pop song and another.
Right. Okay. And I only brought the
So Taylor Swift's voice is not Beyonce's voice. Like they may put out a song that's, it's like verse, how's it go? Verse, chorus, bridge. Right?
Yeah.
Jordan, how's it go?
That sounds about right to me.
Okay. Okay. So they put out a song with that format, and it's got, a little section of rapping in the middle, exactly in the place where all these songs have that little section of rap. But there's still a material differentiation between what the two artists are producing.
Well, can I just cross this? Because for maybe the listeners, because I know myself, I'm not sure what you guys mean by the undifferentiated. So maybe we can crack that egg and then you guys can continue.
Something that is beautiful in the immediacy of its presentation without the discernment of play or difference.
Okay.
So Plotinus's example is sunlight, right?
I love that.
So you're on that beach in Greece, and the thing you're noticing is somehow the beauty of the light.
Similar.
Sorry.
Don't worry.
Yeah. No, go ahead, Jordan.
All good. No, that was my computer. These kind of things I can easily edit out, but we don't even really need to.
Yeah.
So I just asked for that interjection in the sense of wondering if people like myself weren't following that. But yeah, continue, guys, because I think Brady, you were going to ask a question with regard to that, or take that somewhere.
Yeah, I was only going to perhaps try to demonstrate how that kind of the beauty of the undifferentiated we might be able to experience, or at least many people do experience it in pop. But I think Bernard rightly points out that there is still kind of material differentiation between, Taylor Swift's newest song and the one she did 2 albums ago, even if composition wise or musically, they're very similar.
Look, I have a funny story about this. My niece once, was listening to a Hilary Duff album, right? And the first song was kind of catchy, I had to admit. It's like, I kind of understand why an 8-year-old girl might like that song. And then, of course, the second song was similar, a little less catchy. The third song was, again, very similar, a lot less catchy. So, yeah. But now, if I were a, musical analyst, I could probably point to small differences in the performance that, that at least on a formal level, differentiates all the songs on a Hilary Duff album, even though for a casual listener, you'd be bedeviled to tell the difference between one and another, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like the chemist looking at mud.
Exactly. Yeah. I was actually going to bring it back to that because, just in my day-to-day life, it's become popular to just kind of punch down to pop music, or punch up, I guess. It's kind of like what's dominant. And that makes sense.
Down or up. You're punching up if you're punching at the artist. You're punching down if you're punching at the fans.
Yes. Okay. Fair enough. Yeah. So it's very popular to just punch up at pop music in general because, it's formulaic, it's what everyone hears, it's boring, it's uninspired, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But I think it's because of how popular and accepted that claim has become that I've been motivated to defend pop music on, several occasions because, just from that kind of musical perspective, there are these little tiny nuances that distinguish, say, Taylor Swift's newest song from a Beyonce song. And exploring, again, it comes back to the idea of contextualization. Mm-hmm. To an outsider, pop music, if you only ever hear it when you're driving to work, it's all going to sound quite similar. You don't have the context necessary to distinguish the two songs. Sure. However, if you immerse yourself in enough of it, then you can start to look at the different choices. The choice of using this kind of snare sample versus another. Why do they use this kind of synth sound versus another? So it's all those little things, and I think that's really where you can gain a lot of aesthetic pleasure from understanding those differences. And so that's kind of where I've been mentally, because for one, I just want to enjoy all music. Why would I not want to have more things to enrich my life? Yeah. But also, there's just this kind of, this is a bit of an aside, this inherent pleasure in kind of being the underdog in a kind of way, because,
Sure.
Yeah.
It's not true that one Taylor Swift song is exactly the same as the other. That was true of the Hilary Duff album, but I've listened to enough Taylor Swift songs to know that she does make some effort to differentiate one song from another in terms of the arrangement, the theme, the mood, etc. Right? Mm-hmm. And I just personally think that's something a good artist should do. Okay? Mm-hmm. But do you accept the category, Brady, of the guilty pleasure?
I'm very glad you bring this up. Yeah. I want to say no. I'm actually strongly against the idea of a guilty pleasure, and I think we should first really diagnose what the guilt and guilty pleasure means, because as I read it, the guilt arises from I like this thing that isn't conventionally admirable. So a Taylor Swift song, although popular and digestible and enjoyable, I think most I can't say this is true or not. Do critics like Taylor Swift? Maybe they do.
Some of them do. Some of them do. Yeah.
Maybe this is not a good example, but
because she's a little better. She's a little better than run of the mill.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. Well,
she's award-winning. Actually, she's probably a lot better than run of the mill.
She's probably very much better. What's an example of a cruddy pop artist that one might take? I don't know, like One Direction. No, even those were pretty critically acclaimed. I don't know who.
Here's my example.
Yeah,
Krista Berg's Spanish Train. I just love that.
Oh yeah.
And I could put that on, and I still kind of that just melody just falls so easily on me. But if you challenge me to say, well, is Krista Berg on the level of Dylan or Leonard? I said, well, no.
Right.
And I suppose the guilty pleasure, I think the guilty part is that you're consciously reverting to an earlier version of your own taste, which you haven't 100% transcended, but you kind of also have the sense that that's I wouldn't go out and buy a Krista Berg album nowadays, right? We have YouTube, so yeah, I can listen to that Styx album I really liked as a kid, and sometimes I'm pleasantly surprised. Sometimes I'm that wasn't as crappy as I thought it would be, and other times I think, oh God, I can't believe I like that.
Right.
I think the idea of a guilty pleasure fits in the context of a certain self-perceived aesthetic education that one has undergone.
But there's something here that's interesting, because earlier we were mentioning, and I have it just written here, the subject's liberation through the aesthetic community or milieu, as you put it. And so, but now we're talking about the constrictive component of that milieu, because I have to maintain this standard, I have this taste, I have this, there's this standard of taste that one has to have be a part of a milieu in some way. But just like with your family, you're reverted to youth, a youthfulness, like an inner experience of your youthfulness, even with familiarity, things that you're more familiar with. So like I mentioned to Brady before, a film that I just undyingly love, which it's just, just some garbage film from the 90s, and I can still watch it today, and I'm so, wow, forever.
But even though you love it, you're not going to defend it in a certain way.
I won't like philosophically or aesthetically defend it.
So I'm not going to say, I'm not going to defend Krista Berg's Spanish Train, right? Because, the idea of Jesus and the devil playing poker is hokey. So are all the other ideas in every episode, right? Okay, so it's a really hokey record. But on the other hand, it's part of my personal history. And I wouldn't say the album is aesthetically worthless at all, precisely because it appeals to a 10-year-old mind, right? And I don't mean that in an insulting way or a denigrating way, because a 10-year-old mind is like trying to organize itself in terms of its experience of artworks and other things, right? And so there is a beauty even in that innocence.
Well, what about fairy tales?
Fairy tales. Oh,
you go
I
through
think some of them are great.
Exactly. Yeah. You go through the refinement of becoming an adult, reading maybe an adult novel, so to speak. I'm not like a big novel reader per se, but then you look back at a fairy tale, and there's this kind of magical youthfulness to it, which is just totally enrapturing.
And I don't know if I've ever explained this to you, Brady. There's a cycle of sophistication.
Okay.
And it goes like this. I read an article on this once. Okay, so like your aunt out in wherever, you're from Stephenville, right, Brady?
Yeah.
So maybe you've got an aunt in Stephenville Crossing.
Right.
Okay. And she loves Velvet Elvis paintings.
Yeah.
And most people have some person like this in their family, Brady. And her aesthetic response to, the effeminacy or whatever it is that's depicted in the, because he's depicted in an iconographic fashion like Jesus, right? So a certain idea of tenderness or even effeminacy conveyed in that picture of, the Sacred Heart of Elvis. Okay. So she loves that spontaneously. Okay. Now, her kid, who's 15 years old, and he's getting into, Metallica, his response is cringe. I cringe at that.
Right.
Okay. It's like, I can't stand all of Velvet Elvis and all this stuff my aunt loves and the Irish Rover record. Yeah, I can't stand that. Okay. But of course, there's a certain level of coolness beyond that by which you profess a kind of ironic appreciation of Elvis's Blue Hawaii movie. You watch it for yucks, right? Or like you buy a Velvet Elvis painting kind of to laugh at it, okay? And of course, the final point of sophistication was, I read in this article, the point where you go, you know what? After all the Metallica records and Beethoven symphonies and Leonardo masterpieces I've looked at, damn it, I just like Velvet Elvis painting.
Absolutely.
Yes. And so I think what that cycle indicates is that, that the naive doesn't never necessarily leave us, right? The childlike does not necessarily ever leave us. At a certain age, we categorize it as a guilty pleasure if we're worried about what other people think about our aesthetic judgment. And then at a certain point, we just say, the hell, you know what? I like Krista Berg's Spanish Train. You know what? I'm not even going to call it a guilty pleasure. I'm just going to call it a pleasure. I like it. Okay. So I think most people go through some version of that arc, right?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Man,
I haven't gotten back to the Unicorn song, but who knows?
Yeah. Interestingly, no, please, Jordan.
Just as a question, to try to go back there, because this has all opened up the door to what I think was going to be your complete anti-guilty pleasuredom, or not liking that term kind of thing. So maybe you could tell us about that.
Yeah, that's precisely what I'm thinking here. I think as Bernard kind of ended off there, at a certain point, and this is where I am, why should there be guilt in the pleasure? I think we kind of alluded to the idea that, well, you can't or you won't give this kind of defense of, say, a corny 90s film that you just love to rewatch for whatever reason. You won't give that defense. But I do still think that there's a very primitive justification there for the pleasure, and that is, well, the pleasure itself. I mean, because that's such a private experience, you can't articulate that in, any kind of coherent way to another, and so there's nothing communicable about that experience for you. That maybe it's not reflective. But I do think that the feeling that one might have towards it's usually like an object of nostalgia to a certain extent. The guilty pleasure, it's something that you return to, and you're like, I still like this despite me thinking I shouldn't. And maybe that's the guilty aspect. Yeah. But I think the issue is that immediately it's not articulable. I don't know if that's a word, why I still like it, other than I just have this pleasure that's, residual from my childhood. But I think having that attitude towards the object could motivate you to look at it deeper and try to understand why you still have that feeling of why you like it, why you liked it in the past. And that can then transform into just, again, a genuine taste that can just transform itself into an actual communicable position about why you like this corny movie. Because I think there are good defenses of, say, like The Room with Tommy Wiseau, all these like corny, shitty B-list movies. I think there is a good defense of them out there. You just have to kind of work a little bit for it.
Yeah. And I think part of the problem is that criticism and aesthetic judgment is always mediated by discourse, right? So It's not about the immediacy of the aesthetic experience. And so like one thing that, biases you as a teacher is, well, okay, if I play this Dylan album, there's going to be so much more I can say about it than if I play Spanish Train by Krista Berg, right? Mm-hmm. Because Spanish Train by Krista Berg is kind of a direct object of experience. It's kind of an immediate object of aesthetic appreciation, but nobody who likes it's going to overanalyze it.
As I said in the last episode, this kind of whole mindset, this kind of say discipline, this work, this lifestyle, it caters itself away from the silence. Yeah. In the last episode, Brady, we spoke in the context of spiritual experience, right? And so how the aesthetics of spiritual experience, but how discourse would outweigh in this kind of, because we're having a discussion.
We're having a discussion.
We're talking.
Right?
We're not.
And if we were having a discussion about Dylan, it would be a much more interesting discussion than a discussion about Tiny Tim.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
But I don't know. So is because George Steiner brought this up in one of his books. Like, what if we just got rid of criticism? What if we just stopped talking about books? What if we just stopped talking about artworks? Right?
What if creativity was first?
But of course, we're linguistic beings, so that's never going to happen. But it's kind of thought experiment, which he starts his book, Real Presences.
Cool.
Right? Like, what if we just shut up and just experienced things? Well, I mean, we can't. And part of the reason we can't is that we're social beings, right? And if I really, really love Tangled Up in Blue by Dylan, I kind of want to tell you about it. Right? So there's something about that private, incommunicable experience of the artwork that we want to share with others. And of course, the medium of that sharing is going to involve something like language. Let me tell you how great this Tangled Up in Blue song is. Right, it's got references to Dante and all of this stuff, and what profound. Okay, like, part of my selling you on that artwork is going to be talking about it.
So, okay, like, have you guys seen the movie Inception?
I haven't. It's Christopher Nolan.
It's a Christopher Nolan a couple years before this recent one. Brady, you've seen it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, like. Tell me if I'm getting off too much of a tangent here, but to me, that movie was cast as kind of an intelligent attempt at an action movie, and so basically the stupid man's intelligent movie. And so this irony of allowing the ironic distance from a movie and allowing it to speak to you, with that movie spoke to me so deeply. So I see my friends who are really interested in films saying this is the dumbest movie in the world. Yeah. Then I see my friends who like action movies really not enjoying that movie because it's too dense and too, this is too much going on here. To me, that movie illuminated one of Kierkegaard's problems, which is we're caught between two problems, which is the finite and the infinite constantly. So I'm not going to ruin the movie, but anyway, everybody's seen it. What do I care? So the character is constricted by his actual world. And in the end, in the dream world, he's constricted by the infinite subconscious realm of the dream. And so that is, I think, such a dense and like deeply piercing analysis
Yeah.
of like a Kierkegaardian concept.
Mm-hmm.
Or I even saw it as the infinite freedom of subjectivity, Brady, to go back to like a Hegelian concept, right?
Right.
So you haven't seen the film, so I don't want to ruin it, but he gets literally lost in a dreamscape and has to find through that infinity back into the limitations of his finite life.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
It's just truly brilliant. But look at me talking about a stupid action film, right?
Okay.
Like with this
Yeah,
kind of
sure.
intensity and impassioned.
And you can't help but talk about it. That's, Steiner,
Okay.
That's eventually kind of what he says. Like, there's no way to stop from talking about aesthetic experience.
So
Right.
it's still an aesthetic experience. That's still us exploring. That's still us creating in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah. I think what you really bring out there is that, to me, there is no limit of the interpretive possibilities of any piece of art. I think that with any object of art, you can either approach it really deflationary, or you can approach it in a very robust way. You can do it according to invention or in terms of just your own private experience. But I don't think there's any limit to how we can interpret an art. Now, we could say that some of our interpretations might be far-fetched, might not align with the author's intentions, and that's all fine and well. But I still think that we're justified in having that interpretation. So if you want to have this really robust interpretation of Inception contra, your friends, or even what, popular culture might say about the film, I think you're justified doing that because, for me, a lot of these kind of mediums is functionally serving a kind of entertaining purpose. It's there to give us pleasure in some sense. And so if you're getting all this pleasure out of this deep analysis of a movie that people don't think is that deep, you're justified in doing so. I mean, why not, right?
Yes, and the irony continues because when I see a book that says, Breaking Bad and philosophy, I just utterly cringe. Like, so, you know what I mean, right? It's the irony of the distance between us and the aesthetic object, essentially.
Yeah, and so part of that distance is established by critical discourse, and critical discourse has a certain disinterest. I mean, it can't have total you can't be so disinterested that you aren't involved in the object. So there's some kind of interest involved. But relatively speaking, there's a disinterest in, say, if I read a poem by my friend and I don't think it's as good as he could do. Okay. And your friend says, tell me the truth.
Ooh.
And like, I always avoid that situation whenever possible. But
yeah.
Except with my wife, like Jean paints something and she says, tell me what you think honestly. And I tell her what I think honestly. I think you didn't take that painting far enough, or I think you overdid, or whatever. Okay. So there's that kind of disinterest where we are abstracting the work of art from certain social obligations or certain social relations that we have, and considering it on its own, right? And now I wrote another piece way back in which I talked about auras, okay? When you make the aesthetic object an object of disinterested judgment in that way, in a certain sense, you're stripping it of much of what makes it actually significant for ordinary people. Okay? So the example I used was, say, I don't know if they have these as much as they used to, but when I was a kid, they had top 40 countdowns. Okay? And everyone was interested in hearing what the number one song was, and everyone was interested in, singing along with the number one song, dancing, right? Okay. Now, I could take that situation where and what was the band was when I was a kid, there was this horrible one-hit wonder band, the what the hell were they called? Bay City Rollers. Okay?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and everyone loved that song and everyone danced around to that song. And of course, part of what made that song effective was the agreement, the social agreement, that we would all experience this song together and have the same reactions to it. Okay. So if I took, Ziggy Stardust by David Bowie, and I introduced it in that social context as a disinterested object of appreciation, it would not function as a piece of music ordinarily functions. Okay? People would go, what the hell is that? Like, is that gay or something? Well, what the hell is that? Right?
Yeah.
So I think disinterest is always going to be a certain sense at war with aesthetic experience, because aesthetic experience is often in a social, a cultural, or a ritual context that is part of the significance of at least the reception of the object. Okay. So, and I guess this is a just long, complicated way of saying most people aren't nerds.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think so. Your critique of the concept of the disinterested would probably be, well, there are certain kinds of conversations where that's a relevant move in certain kinds of contexts, but not in others.
Right.
The function of Bay City Rollers, Saturday Night is not to be a great work of art, but it has a function.
Yeah.
There's something beautiful about the unification of everyone along this, arbitrary line of the number one hit. Everybody dances. And the important thing is everyone knows what it is. So it's a bit of common knowledge that everyone knows what the number one So the
is.
supposedly aesthetic object becomes more communal.
Communal.
Sure, it's not the refined milieu of us discussing it philosophically, but it's this strange sense of community, like lightning that shoots across an entire culture. Everybody hears the same song. Right?
Yeah.
That's kind of amazing.
Kind of amazing. And of course, that doesn't happen that much anymore, does it? Because, people have burrowed down far more into niche tastes.
But then again, a lot of Despacito a couple of years ago.
Except for Ed Sheeran.
Just name you. I think I made myself sound about 70 when I said that.
Yeah.
Really good song,
Because Ed Sheeran has established himself not only as a musical touchstone, but as a lyrical touchstone. Everyone quotes Ed Sheeran songs in their papers and stuff, right?
Are you serious? Are you students?
Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. No, I had to, I sometimes give an assignment where they analyze a pop song. And of course, half the papers are the A-Team by Ed Sheeran. And I kind of have to say, you can't do the A-Team by Ed Sheeran because I'll go crazy.
I've read it.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Okay. But okay, I mean, there are certain things I dismiss, and like precisely because the university gives you a certain bias in favor of discourse. So I have to tell the students things like, no, you can't do Stupid Ho by Nicki Minaj because there's not enough to say about Stupid Ho.
Yeah, is there not? You could get kind of critical about that.
You could, but it's not the kind of criticism I generally do, right? From a media studies perspective or something, right? But I don't think it would be aesthetic or poetic criticism.
So maybe this brings us back to a dichotomy that Brady illuminated to me in our kind of preemptive discussion. So we didn't drive it directly today, but we could drive it now.
Yeah.
So this weighing towards the edge of discourse, and as a kind of Libra, because we did, Brady, as you know, an episode on astrology. So I've been thinking about my astrology.
No, nice.
Yeah, it's really fun, this kind of symbolic understanding of thyself. But so as a Libra, let's look at a bit of balance here. When we look at the other side of that discourse, or I think Brady yesterday you put it as, let me just see, critical domain versus on the left hand here, the observational, which Brady likened to the inspirational, the impassioned, kind of adhering to the sense of feeling, this direct sense that you're referring to. So maybe there's more to be said about that weight or the inability to do that, like as a specific dichotomy in a certain way, because reflection always feeds into experience always feeds into reflection. So am I just making a mess of this, or do we have anything else to say about that dichotomy?
I think it's a useful hermeneutic, but I think I mentioned yesterday also, and as you've kind of brought out in your own response, it's not exactly dichotomous, because if we look at this kind of twofold relation between experience and reflection, my experience of pleasure when I listen to, let's say, Taylor Swift's Folklore, one of her newer albums, I actually quite like it, by the way, but so there is a kind of experience there that in which, I'm liking it. I just feel this pleasure. It's kind of a vague, it's like a non-specific kind of pleasure, we might say. Like, I'm not immediately aware of what I'm being pleased by. However, then we can take that experience and bring it up to the level of reflection. We can point to now the different things that I liked or didn't like. And that normally, that's a part of this process, is appealing to certain conventions, looking at certain criteria, how much you value them, blah, blah, blah. However, the reason that this isn't like dichotomous is because those things that you break it down into when you analyze it are operative unconsciously. Like these are the things that you naturally pay attention to. When it's done right, it's going to give you the most pleasure. And so in your reflection, you're just being aware of what's going on in experience. And then your experience is kind of giving you the content to break down. And so like it's this positive feedback loop that just keeps going on and on and on and on. And but yeah.
Like for Heidegger, it's attunement or mood, depending on the translation. It's just our receiving of all of that within like our receiving of the world. We just arrive at the mood. Yeah. So it's like to be inspired, to feel critical. These are, in a sense, united in the sense of just receiving the world, right? It's not like we just, I mean, I guess that's kind of against Kant's notion too, a little bit, but
okay.
But please.
You know, I mean, one way to think about this, perhaps, I don't know, is if you think about the aesthetic responses of babies.
Okay.
Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so a baby's, if I'm a certain age, say at 2.5, right? Wow, there's a garbage truck. Oh my God, look at that garbage truck. It's freaking amazing. Look at that thing. Picking up the garbage. Okay, so that kind of experience through the process of aesthetic education, that kind of experience of a thing like a garbage truck gets duller and duller, right? Because the garbage truck becomes more and more a familiar part of my world. And the more it becomes a familiar part of the world, the less inclined I am to view it as an object in itself, okay? Mm-hmm. And then I need an artwork for that thrill, right? And, I don't know, maybe one could go all Freudian here, but maybe artworks are some kind of substitute that we have for our inability to experience the world as new. Garbage. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there.
I like that.
Babies love garbage trucks.
They sure do.
And maybe they're right. I mean,
we continuously develop a new sense of the new.
Yeah, a new sense of the new.
Wow.
Right.
So we have to represent and reflect to ourselves.
Yeah.
Novelty itself.
Novelty itself has come to us in more and more sophisticated forms in order to restore the wow experience of looking at a truck when you're 2.
Yeah.
Right. I think that also explains why there's so much excitement around, like, for instance, the new James Webb Telescope, because we're seeing something new. There's a lot of novelty there. This is totally new for us. And there's, by extension, all this excitement surrounding it. So I think it's a very useful model. I think it helps explain a lot. Very insightful. Dan.
Maybe, I don't know.
I'm going to have to digest that one a bit more. That's pretty interesting stuff.
Okay.
I guess we're coming up on the hour, guys, past the hour. So is there anything we didn't cover, Brady, that you were hoping to get to today? It seems like we went all over the place, but it's been a pretty conversation.
I think it went better than I could have ever expected. In true Parmenius fashion, we really mapped out every part, every landscape, every question to be, I think, unveiled here.
Okay. But I bet Brady should get a concluding statement regardless.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh boy, how do we
message for our listeners? One thing you want to make.
Don't feel guilt in any pleasure. Use that motivation to understand why you like it. No guilty pleasures, damn it.
Yeah. Use it to look deeper into your sense of the aesthetic.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right, guys, this has been another Parmenius. Brady, thanks so much. Brady Sheppard and Bernard Wills. I'm Jordan Sheppard, your host, I suppose. And thanks again, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yep. Bye. See you later, Brady. Good luck.
Thank you. Yep. Talk soon.
Bye-bye.